Good morning. If you'll take your seats, we can get started. A hush came over the land. I must say I am really enjoying the energy in this room this morning. Let's keep that going throughout the day. I'm Donna Jacobs. I'm one of the senior vice presidents at the University of Maryland Medical System, and I'm so delighted that you all are here to start this conversation and dialogue. I'm going to be your MC, your sort of logistics person for the day. You're stuck with me. We're convened in this room this morning to start with a wonderful keynote presentation by a very dynamic speaker. Following that, we have a beautiful panel on several overarching topics, mental health and substance abuse. And then we have a presentation on recovery and wellness. So we'll be here for the duration of the morning. I want to make sure that you understand what is in your blue folders that you received when you came in. There is an event schedule, which is the day at a glance, if you will. It includes the room numbers where each presentation will be given. There is a complete fold-out program that has a short biography and a short description of each of the topics for your perusal. And importantly, there are index cards in that folder. And here's why. We have a central microphone here in the middle aisle, and the day is designed for your questions, presentations and your questions. We recognize that some may not feel as comfortable asking the questions at an open microphone, so the index cards are in your folder so that if you choose, you can write your questions, pass them to the outer aisles, and people in red shirts will pick them up for you. Hopefully we'll get to everything during each presentation. So following the keynote speaker, there'll be time for questions. Following the first panel, there'll be time for questions. And following the presentation on wellness and recovery, there will be time for questions as well. When we move into the afternoon, I'm going to speak about lunch a little bit later, but when we move into the afternoon, that's when we'll have our breakout sessions. There are 10 of them in total. 5 of them begin at 1:15, then there's a break, and then the other 5 will begin at 3. I do invite you to visit the exhibitors out front. There are now 13 organizations out there that are in the business of mental health and substance abuse, and they have resources available to you and are very eager to talk to you throughout the day. If at any point you feel lost or you need information, find someone in red, these red shirts that say staff. They're here to help you. There'll be wayfinders on this floor and on the 3rd floor as well, which is where some of the breakout sessions will be. We are also, for your information, live streaming this morning's session, so you can wave to our friends down in Southern Maryland and Charles County. There are about 70 people down there who have convened to watch this, and as well, others we know are watching from their desks for the morning session. Comfort stations, you need that information. They're on the wall right behind me and in the same location on the 3rd floor. With that, let's get started. I'm ready. Hope you are. At this time, let me introduce Bob Krensik, who is our President and CEO for the University of Maryland Medical System, as he brings us greetings.
Thank you, Donna, and good morning, everybody, and most importantly, welcome to the University of Maryland Baltimore campus. Again, I'm Bob Krensik. I'm the President and CEO of the University of Maryland Medical System, and on behalf of our partners here from the University of Maryland Baltimore, led by Dr. Jay Perman, we want to welcome everybody here today. My organization, the University of Maryland Medical System, spans the state. We have the University of Maryland Medical Center right across Lombard Street and 11 other hospitals out across the state. So I have the privilege of being the leader of that group and have been involved with this for over 30 years, and I've seen the issues that we're talking about here today evolve over that time, and it is just unbelievable and remarkable how things have changed. Today's program, Not All Wounds Are Visible, a community conversation about mental health and substance abuse. Really, we couldn't be picking a better time and place to be talking about this issue. And, given all the stories that, we hear and read in the news, we know that our communities, our Maryland communities, and that's what we're really all about here today, are challenged by very anxiety-producing events and drug and alcohol abuse like really never before. And most importantly, when I see this, all of these problems affect everyone. They affect everyone virtually in all across this state, and they do not discriminate. Whether you're young, whether you're old, whether you're working, whether you're not working, whether you're black, white, Hispanic, or Asian, whether you're rich or poor, mental health and substance abuse impact us all. They impact our families. They impact our communities. It's just a tremendous issue. And here in Baltimore, this is a statistic that I was looking at the other day. 1 in 6 individuals here in Baltimore report that their mental health was not good for at least 8 days out of the month. Think about that. That's a quarter of the month. And last year, and this is what we're reading a lot about, 2,089 Marylanders lost their lives to alcohol or substance abuse, and that was a 66% increase over the prior year. Shocking statistics, and being in the middle of a large healthcare delivery system, we are focused on this, but it is sobering to see those statistics. But despite all the stigmas associated with addressing these issues, our collective attention is now turning towards these ongoing challenges. I'm happy to report that Dr. Leana Wen, the Baltimore City Health Commissioner, is on a crusade to address drug abuse here in the city. The governor and the state legislature are looking at measures, of course, to reduce opioid deaths, and a joint council of our Maryland House of Delegates and our Maryland Senate is addressing behavioral health issues, including mental health and substance abuse issues. By our efforts today, right here, with this community conversation about mental health and substance abuse, we want to engage you, the public, in this dialogue. And there really are several important questions that we want to try to engage everyone in today. What is mental health? How do I recognize a concern in myself or others with mental health? How do I, and this is very important, our keynote speaker will speak to this, how do we overcome some of the stigmas that follow this topic and seek help? How can I help myself or someone else with these issues? And how do I cope with violence and trauma in my community? We see it every day. Right across the street is the Maryland Shock Trauma Center. Hard to believe, but 8,000 Marylanders that come into that trauma center every day of all types of trauma. But trust me, violence is an issue here. And then how do I address addiction? Poor mental health and substance abuse are really not isolated issues. They affect our families, they affect our communities, and they affect a person's ability to seek medical care and maintain good physical health. Good mental health, good physical health go hand in hand. Without one, it's very hard to drive the other. So our job today is to help people become and stay well. And if you follow the Maryland healthcare industry, in the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a major shift in how hospitals get paid. Our focus is now on population health. It's keeping people out of hospitals. It's keeping people well. And a lot of what we're about today is focused on those same topics. So again, unless we address the behavioral health issues in our communities, we are leaving out a big component of population health and better health. And I know at the University of Maryland Medical System, we are working hard with the governor, regulators, and others to keep mental health in the front of this population health conversation. I want to send out a few thank yous here. I want to first thank all of our speakers who have very graciously donated their time to today's program. I want to also thank our sponsors, including the University of Maryland Health Plans, the Recovery Center of America, and the Bergen Group. And of course, I want to thank the University of Maryland Community Health Improvement Committee and our event planning group. I hope very sincerely that you have a terrific day here of not just learning, but also conversation on this tremendously important topic. So again, I want to thank everyone for coming out. I often tell people the most precious asset you have is your time, and the fact that you're willing to take it today is very important to us, but I think speaks volumes about how important this topic is. So I'm going to get off the stage, but I want to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Kay Redfield Jamison. Dr. Jamison is an author, a clinical psychologist, and faculty member at Johns Hopkins Medicine across town. She suffered from bipolar disorder since early adulthood and had personal struggles with severe mania, depression, and thoughts of suicide. She presents a very unique insight into the clinical and non-clinical challenges of people with serious mood disorders. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jamison, who will speak to us about the myths and stigma surrounding mental health and wellness. Dr. Jamison. Looks like trouble.
I think I'll be all right. Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'd add just one political note, that the Senate bill and the House bill could not be more antithetical to promoting the well-being of health in the United States in terms of psychiatric care, psychological care for people who have mental illness and drug and alcohol problems. That's just a little note for those of us who've worked in mental health advocacy for 30 years. It's a little ungluing to see always the first thing that goes out of any kind of appropriations bill or any kind of legislation is psychiatric and substance abuse. So, end of sermon. Stigma is ingrained in ancient attitudes held by virtually every society on earth. These attitudes are clear in the decisions that societies make and in the behaviors that societies tolerate. Stigma, by its nature, is neither rational nor fair. Newspapers and television stations, for example, can print or broadcast remarks about those with mental illness that would not be tolerated if made about any other minority or disadvantaged group. Stigma insinuates its way into public decisions about access to health care, health insurance, job discrimination, and research priorities. Those who have mental illness also stigmatize themselves. They do not or cannot demand of their lawmakers or healthcare delivery systems that which they deserve. Their expectations of society tend to be remarkably low and not consistent with the very large voting bloc that they represent. Such self-stigmatizing has dangerous consequences. It inhibits acknowledging illness and indeed recognizing it. It decreases the odds of seeking treatment, and it makes less likely the acceptance of treatment that is recommended. The inability to discuss mental illness in an informed and straightforward way, to deal with it as the major public health problem that it is unjustifiable in the 21st century. There is stigma against mental illness within the clinical community as well, from doctors, psychologists, nurses, social workers, who have had no serious cause to examine their own beliefs because their professional communities have not thought it important enough to see that they do so. Most clinicians are compassionate, but there are too many who are not. There is another group that contributes, albeit unwillingly, to stigma, a group that I think of as the silent, successful people. I got a bee in my bonnet one day and wrote an op-ed piece for the Washington Post on this, of all the wealthy people in Washington who benefit from research and good treatment, and who don't talk about their illness, which continues to stigmatize it. People who get well because they have gotten good clinical care and because they are the beneficiaries of first-rate research enterprises, but who are afraid to speak out about their mental illnesses for fear of personal or professional retribution. This is completely understandable, as I will get to in a minute, because I'll be talking personally about my own experiences of going public. It's not something you want to do in your spare time, but it's also something that has consequences. Keeping quiet has consequences. It perpetuates the misperception that people with mental illness do not get well. And of course, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people with mental illness do get well. As a result, what remains in the public eye is the great mass of untreated or inadequately treated mental illness. The newspaper accounts of violence, the homeless mentally ill, and the untreated mental illness that people see in their friends and colleagues. What is not seen is all of the people, the computer programs, lawyers, successful businessmen, teachers, secretaries, politicians, physicians, who have been successfully treated, who show up for work, who compete, who succeed, and who live very good lives. Everywhere I go in the United States, in city after city, and on university campus after university campus, I see the suffering of those who do not avail themselves of treatment because of stigma, because of a sense that if they do, they will not get into graduate school, they will not get their state licenses, and so forth. So, what can be done about stigma? First, find another word. The word stigma stigmatizes. As soon as you use the word stigma, the implication is that there's something on the receiving end that needs to be stigmatized. The word discrimination, on the other hand, has a satisfyingly legal ring to it. I would also say, just as a general point, and this happens everywhere, is the confusion of mental health with mental illness. These are illnesses. Bipolar illness is an illness. Severe depression is an illness. The anxiety disorders are illnesses. Schizophrenia is an illness. When we turn them into mental health issues, we really diminish that they are illnesses. And we make it much less likely that the state legislature or anybody else who's funding is going to make those discriminations. It gets all globbed up in the same ball. And I think it's terribly important. I mean, there's a huge amount of science here. It's not like these are unstudied illnesses. We've studied these illnesses, since long before Hippocrates, 2,500 years ago. And the modern science in the last 50 years, neuroscience, leaves no doubt that these are illnesses. So everywhere you see mental health issues, I don't have a mental health issue. I mean, I do, I'm sure, but I have a disease. I have a really bad genetic illness. And every time I call that, if I were to call that a mental health issue, that diminishes the severity of and also the notion of treatability, we might add. It's a lot harder to treat health issues in general than illness. Second, it is essential to understand why stigma exists. Just saying that stigma is wrong is not enough, and it will never change the way things are now. Thus, animal behavior teaches us that animals discriminate against those who are odd, those who show even very subtle differences from other animals. Perhaps there are ancient, hardwired reasons for fear and discrimination. Doesn't make it right, but it makes it a little bit more understandable, and if you're looking at root causes, it's a little bit more important, I think, to look at what actually causes things. I think saying that we should just change attitudes, we have a long track record of actually not being able to change attitudes about mental health, and some of the recent surveys are pretty discouraging about that. We, like other animals, fear that which is unknown, unpredictable, or potentially dangerous. The fear and emotional, financial, and physical costs of mental illness are high for family members, friends, society, and colleagues. It is not benign to those who are directly affected by the stress and uncertainty generated in its wake. Legitimate concerns must be discussed forthrightly, and much more so than has been done to date. Third, and relatedly, patients and their family members need to recognize their political strength. We are a significant percentage of the population. We are a very, very, very large block of voters. Fourth, we need to start our efforts against discrimination by working within our own medical and mental health communities. There needs to be more honest and intelligent discussion about mental illness within the ranks of those responsible for treating the suffering of others. We need to make it easier for doctors and students to receive good psychiatric care without being professionally penalized for seeking help. And we need to address directly the issue of impaired doctors. I mean, I teach at Hopkins. We all know about impaired doctors who have drug or alcohol problems or psychiatric problems. Those, you want to make the incentive to get treatment, not to avoid being honest about what you've got. These are treatable illnesses. We need to teach by example that mental illnesses are common, painful, and potentially deadly, but they can be treated and should be treated, and we should make it easy for people to be treated. Finally, we need to convey to the public as well as to our colleagues how extensive our scientific understanding of mental illness really is. We know a lot. Public perception about mental illness lags decades behind what science teaches us. We should campaign on the positive, try to captivate the minds of the public about the excitement of studying the brain. We are fortunate to live in a time when genetics, brain imaging, and the development of new treatments have radically changed the lives of those with depression, bipolar illness, schizophrenia, and other psychiatric illnesses. Research is, has been, and always will be the most potent destigmatizer. And we know this, for example, from, if you look at the history of medicine over the last 100 years or so, when did people stop destigmatizing people who had epilepsy, having public fits? When we could treat it, right? When did people start talking about cancer? In the 1950s, you wouldn't even talk about the word cancer. You wouldn't use the word cancer. When did we start talking about cancer? When it ceased to be always a death threat. And what about AIDS? When did the destigmatization of AIDS come about? It wasn't because society willed it. It was because the AIDS community was incredibly effective in its political organization of demanding money from the government to study and treat, and as a result, it became an illness that people could live with. It was no longer a death sentence. And at that point, it began to get less stigmatized. Psychiatric illness, to the extent that it has begun to be slightly less stigmatized than it was, is because people now perceive it as more treatable than it used to. Most people, although still frightened and misinformed about mental illness, know much more now than they did even 5 years ago. Public education campaigns and the widely advertised availability of effective medications and psychotherapies have made an impact on public attitudes. But all of us need to recognize how vulnerable so many of our family, friends, and colleagues are, and reach out accordingly. Then we need to reach out to the rest of society to let them know that we will not tolerate the intolerable, that we will not tolerate the kind of pain and discrimination that has gone on for far too long. I would like to sort of switch gears, but they're very related because I've been in academic psychiatry all my life. I taught at UCLA for many years in the Department of Psychiatry, and I've been at Hopkins since woolly mammoths roamed the earth. I've been here a long time. So I'm sort of more privy than I would like to be about what goes on in medical schools about colleagues who have mental illness. So I just like to talk a little bit what happens when you go public. I'd like to make a few personal remarks about stigma. I've taught in academic psychiatry departments all of my professional life, and as someone who's also suffered from bipolar illness, I've been acutely aware of the kinds of jabs and wounding stereotypes that mental illness brings out in many people. Yet it was only when I wrote a book about my illness that I became truly aware of the extent of discrimination that people with mental illness face. The decision to write about my illness was difficult. I'm a clinical psychologist who holds licenses to practice in California and in the District of Columbia, and I had hospital privileges at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. I am someone who studies and writes about the illness I have, and I knew that as a result of my disclosure, my work would be subject to questions of objectivity by my colleagues. The deeply personal nature of my book would require that I give up my clinical practice. I was as well a teacher of young doctors and graduate students, and like most people, have been brought up to be private about personal matters. My father, an Air Force officer, scientist, and a pilot, kept to the military code that the strength of character demanded forbearance in the presence of difficulty. My mother was similarly reserved in dealing with personal problems. Both assumed, as they assumed the air, the undeniable correctness of the WASP ethic that one kept one's problems to oneself, admitted no weakness to anyone. Being an Episcopalian didn't help. The frozen chosen had thawed over the years, but still veered toward immoderate discretion. I kept my fears hidden and grew up tightly sealed as a vault. I did not confess, concede, or admit. It was not done. I liked and believed in this view of the world. The people I most admired embodied those values. They complained rarely. They got on with life. They didn't deposit their private struggles into the public domain. But such values were suited for a simpler world than the one in which I found myself as a young woman contending with a sick mind. My innocence decayed alongside my sanity and never quite came back. Experiences I had had as an adult made scant sense in the context of my childhood ethic. I had been brought to my knees by madness and despair, my values shaken beyond easy repair. I was a clinician and an academic, unavoidably aware of the devastation experienced by those with mental illnesses such as my own. I looked inward and then around me. It did not take much to grasp that privacy and reticence, however much I might find them admirable, made life more difficult for others than it needed to be. Silence about mental illness bred a quiet ugliness and set in place the conditions for unnecessary suffering and unnecessary death. I found my own silence about bipolar illness increasingly intolerable. True, my parents had taught me to keep private matters private, but they'd also taught me to think for myself and have some sense of responsibility toward others. I felt myself a hypocrite, a repellent state that gradually wore down my instincts for professional self-preservation and concealment. Still, I was wary of being labeled by my academic and medical colleagues as a manic depressive psychologist, rather than as being seen as a psychologist who happened to have manic depressive illness. I knew, too, that for many, the questions of professional impairment would be a critical issue. And I also firmly believed that it would be a completely legitimate concern. Those who specialized in psychology or psychiatry would present a special set of problems. I risked newly vigilant eyes observing my actions and appraising my moods, newly honed ears that would listen for skips in reason, real or imagined anger. It was an unattractive prospect. I would also be giving live ammunition to competitors or anyone I had irritated over the years. I had hallucinated and been delusional on more than one occasion, had been paralytic with depression for months on end. My behavior at times had been bizarre and disturbing. By anyone's standards, I had been severely ill. I had tried to kill myself and nearly died from a massive overdose of lithium, the same medication I had written extensively about in medical journals and strongly advocated that others take. In the early stages of my illness, I had taken lithium only fitfully and reluctantly. One can hope for understanding, but not assume it. I spoke with the chairman of my department at Johns Hopkins, in part because I respected his judgment, and in part because I had to. I told him I hoped it might be helpful to others to write about my intersecting worlds of researcher, clinician, teacher, and patient, but that I did not want to put the Department of Psychiatry or the Johns Hopkins Hospital in an awkward public or legal position. We both knew the inevitability of the who is in charge of the asylum quips. More substantively, there were very real legal, educational, and clinical issues. My chairman listened carefully as I laid out my concerns. When I had finished, he looked at me and he said, "You know, Kay, you have it completely backwards." He mentioned the legendary surgeon, William Halsted, who was the first chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins. It was known that Halsted was a cocaine and a morphine addict, he said. When he was impaired, his colleagues took it as their responsibility to protect Professor Halsted's patients from Professor Halsted when he was sick. But they also looked after Professor Halsted as best they could so that he could continue to do his research, write, and train young surgeons. If Hopkins can't do that for you, he said, Hopkins has no business being in business. He could not have been more sympathetic. He made it clear that I had his unequivocal support and that I should let him know if anybody on the faculty or house staff made it difficult for me. He arranged for me to have lunch with the president of the Johns Hopkins Hospital, who likewise gave me his complete backing. He reiterated my chairman's statement that Hopkins should be at the forefront of lessening the stigma against those with psychiatric illnesses. He hoped my being open about my own illness would make it easier for doctors and other clinicians to seek out, receive, and give good medical care. Both he and my chairman were unambivalent in their message that they would back up my decision in whatever way they could, and over the years since, both of them have. They gave me the blessing of a great teaching hospital. I am not so naive as to think this is usual in medical schools and hospitals. I know that it is not. But it is exemplary. And it's from the exemplary, not from that which is done badly, that one learns and moves forwards. The response from the public and my colleagues, although generally quite positive, was a bit more complicated. I received an astonishing number of letters after my book, An Unquiet Mind, was published, tens of thousands of letters, actually. Many of them were quite psychotic and frightening, written by people who fear or hate the mentally ill, quite a few of them who raved on about the terrible manic depressives they had known. Others told me I deserved my illness because I had not been a sufficiently devout Christian. Yet others that I had no business writing, teaching, or seeing patients, despite the fact that my illness was well controlled. Several colleagues made it clear to me it would have been best to keep my science public and my illness private. Of the many thousands of letters that I received, some of the most difficult to read were those from doctors and other health professionals. They recounted their own experiences with depression and bipolar illness, the lack of support they'd received from their mentors or colleagues, and too often their dismissals from graduate school, medical school, or residency programs. All expressed the concern that it was hard to be straightforward about mental illness when their academic degrees, medical licenses, clinical referral sources, or hospital privileges were at stake. But more than anything over the years, I have been impressed by what people survive. The pain, the injustices of a healthcare system that makes no pretense of fairness toward those with mental illness, financial ruin, violence, and most devastating, the suicide of a child, husband or wife, or parent. Everywhere I have gone, I have seen the wreckage left behind by those who have suffered from mental illness or suicide. I've also seen the resilience, inventiveness, and generosity of those who contend with it. Nowhere has this mixture of devastation and bounty been more obvious than talking with students with mental illness. after, when the paperback version of my book, An Unquiet Mind, came out, I asked my publisher if they would send me to college campuses instead of sending me to, posh upper middle class independent bookstores. As much as I love them and as pleasant as it is, the average age of onset of bipolar illness is 18, 19, 20. So I really wanted to reach out to college students. And also, I had felt at that age, I had no one to talk about. I first got ill when I was 17. I had no one to talk about. Nobody knew anything at that time. On every college campus I spoke, in every medical school, students have described to me not only the pain and helplessness they feel, but the lack of understanding they feel from their professors and college administrations, the lack of health insurance, their fears about being asked to go on medical leave, not allowed to return, and how aware they are of their disruptive behaviors. When I talk to students, and this is in this day and age of helicoptering parents who, frequently you're talking to a group of students, a student will be on the cell phone finding out what their mother thinks about what class they should be registering, and it is just astonishing. Anyway, if you ask these same students, how many of you have tried to kill yourself? And many, many hands go up, and you ask them, how many of you talked to your parents about that? Not very many. So the other side of helicoptering parenting in a funny sort of way is disappointing parents or not feeling that parents can actually help you out when you most need help. So this is actually quite disturbing sort of thing. Students invariably ask me, do you worry about getting sick again? How have you stayed well? And I tell them, yes, of course I worry about getting sick again. But it is good to worry. I tell them it's hard to get well, it's hard to stay well, but it certainly can be done. I tell them that bipolar illness is a bad illness to get, but now is a great time to get it. Science is moving fast, and public understanding is better than it has ever been. They are lucky to be diagnosed and treated early. I have been deeply touched by the courage of these students. And I just want to end with a story about a very young student that I saw in Colorado. I was asked to speak to a group of about 50 kids under the age of 17, all with bipolar illness. And as you know, bipolar illness in younger children is more severe. The prognosis is less good. It's harder to treat. And really importantly, they haven't the cognitive ability to put these symptoms in the context of an illness or treatability or anything like that. They experience the same pain. They have the same fears of those who are older, but because it's more severe, they cannot understand as much about their illness. I was particularly aware of this when I spoke to this young group of adolescents and children. They ranged in age from 7 to 17 and all suffered from bipolar illness. We talked about what it was like to struggle with depression and mania and what it was like to have to take medications that had very bad side effects, how hard it was to concentrate and study with mania and depression, and that it was nearly impossible to make friends and family members understand what was going on. These were things they knew too well, too young. But we spoke of hope as well and how one could live a really good life with the illness. It was hard, but it could be done. I answered their questions as best I could. Then as I was leaving, a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8, came up to me and put his hand in mine. He looked up at me and he said, "Are you really okay?" I put my arms around him and I felt him sobbing against me. "Yes, I am," I said. "I really am, and you will be too." I reached into my handbag, pulled out my keychain, and removed the plastic Bugs Bunny charm I had carried for years and years. I told him it was my extra lucky charm because it had not just one rabbit's foot, but 4. A small smile appeared. I gave him the key fob, and I assured him that Bugs Bunny would bring him the same good luck he had brought me. I hoped that this would be true, but the world and his illness being the way that they are, I was not sure that luck would carry him as far as would be fair. Thank you. Are there any questions? There's a microphone there at the center aisle. Yeah. Can you talk louder, or it's not on?
My name is Christine Miller, and I work in the area of researching the causes of psychosis, and now kind of segueing into substance use as a cause of psychosis. So my question is, would you agree that my perception is that the stigma or discrimination, if you will, towards mental illness is greater than for substance use at this time in our country? And this actually impedes the ability for the public at large to perceive the connection between drug use and psychosis in particular. Because what happens is families can talk to their friends about, oh yes, my son used marijuana, for example, but he's in recovery now, or used heroin, but is in recovery. But if psychosis occurs, they just get quiet. And so there's no public discourse about this issue. The legislators are unaware of it in terms of laws that they are fashioning, and I perceive this as a real problem. Would you agree?
I would agree with part of it. I think psychosis is a very large term, and generally substance abuse-induced psychosis is with people who are genetically predisposed in that direction. It doesn't matter. Anyway, I would say that people, once somebody's psychotic, do tend to respond to it because the person's psychotic. My concern would be that we should all be talking more about both substance abuse and mental illness. In the case of bipolar illness, it's the highest comorbidity in psychiatry. 60% of people with bipolar illness have a history of alcohol and or drug abuse. I think you want to make people aware of what the symptoms are of depression and of drug abuse. One of the programs that Hopkins does with Karen Schwartz is starting here in the Baltimore public school systems, but now well around the country and a little bit internationally, is you just go into the school systems and start talking about educating students, teachers, and parents about the symptoms of depression. No big hoopla about anything else. Just say, these are the symptoms of depression, really treatable illness, really important to get it treated early. It gets worse otherwise, really bad consequences if it doesn't get treated. Substance abuse being one of them. But suicide also being one of them. But you don't want to get in to start talking about suicide so much as I think the mental illnesses. So I think we have a long way to go just in general. I think psychosis is, that can be related to drugs, it can be related to brain tumors, it can be related to mania. A good chunk of people with mania get psychosis, schizophrenia. So it's a rather large term.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Dr. Jameson. My name's Denise Camp from On Our Own of Maryland. I wanted to know, when you were in the midst of your illness, since we're going to be talking about tools in recovery, what type of tools did you use to help you cope with the effects of your bipolar disorder?
Overwhelmingly good medical care. And I think that, there are a lot of things perhaps. I mean, I had great friends and family. I was very, very lucky in that respect. But I think the person who had supervised my clinical work when I was an intern was somebody who was tough, smart, who was a really good psychopharmacologist and a really good psychotherapist, and didn't draw the line arbitrarily, as was the case very often back then. So I had a really, really good doctor, and I think that everything falls from that. I think in the case of bipolar illness, if you don't get the medical side of it right, not only do you not treat the illness, you can make people a lot worse. So I think that's very important. I am also, I'm a great believer in reading and in camaraderie and music and all sorts of things. But those things will not treat bipolar illness. So, I mean, I think you can do lots of things in life. And as I say, I think the support of my family and friends was inordinately important to me. But what kept me alive was a good doctor, and the fact that I'm very lucky I respond very well to lithium. So.
Good morning, everyone. Dr. Jameson, you had made mention that oftentimes, particularly students and others, were reluctant to talk about this, particularly approaching their parents. I would like to say something. I'm Cheryl Maxwell with the Black Mental Health Alliance. Very often, these issues are intergenerational. We should have parents who are talking to their children to let them know that these are issues that their families have faced. In my own personal situation, when I went back and did a family tree, my gracious, every generation, there were persons in our family that had suffered these issues. So parents, we know what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, even if you want to keep it in your own household, still have the conversations, educate our people, our young people, adults, etc., so that they can be on the offensive as opposed to having to take the defensive measures.
I could not agree with you more. I think that's part of why I was emphasizing the programs that teach parents as well. I am struck year after year by the number of parents who learn about Mondo Bizarro diseases that no child will ever get and couldn't tell you 3 symptoms of depression, which is very likely going to hit them, one of their kids or a friend of theirs, and it's what's going to kill one of their kids if the kids die. And that's quite striking to me. And certainly when you're talking about a genetic illness where it's gone on forever, you want to just say if your kids are going off to school, look, we've got this illness in our family. The odds are you're not going to get it, but these are some of the symptoms that go along with it. Here's a list of 3 doctors in the community, wherever it is you're going to school, who know something about it, who are competent, and so forth. You want to just be direct. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Jameson. I just want to say what a privilege it is to be in the same room with you. I read your book shortly before I was diagnosed at the age of 40, and that was about 30 years ago. At that time, it was not bipolar, it was manic depressive illness. And I think it gave me a huge boost and it told me that I was not alone. And I just wanted to ask about the other, you were mentioning how it is hereditary, and in my case, it was my father. When you have a situation where the child is in is in a family where there's active mental illness, how do you address the child's illness as well as, you just to get past the parents just not wanting to see?
I think it's probably slightly easier now. I think, as always, if there's a concern, you want to encourage kids from school on to be independent and to seek help. I mean, I think that's part of, you're asking about coping. I think teaching kids to be a little bit more independent and seeking out help in the case of, because this happens more often than not, that you have, I have a sister, me, and my father, plus all the generations up and down that have this illness. This is not an uncommon situation, and genetic illnesses run in families by definition. And so you want to be able to address that issues as well. But I think also in terms of, thank you for your remark. I was very fortunate. I just finished writing a book about a man named Robert Lowell, a great American poet, who had 20 hospitalizations for mania. One of the reasons I wrote about him was character and being an exemplar, is that I think in a way we've lost our way about reaching out to others for example. And when I was 17, I was very fortunate that my English teacher gave me a couple of books by Robert Lowell and said, I think you may find this of help. And he's somebody who was hospitalized for 20 different times with really, really bad mania, and yet got up and fought again and wrote brilliant, some of the most important poetry of the 20th century. So I was interested in that issue of character, the intersection of character and example, as well as disease and, in this case, genius.
Hi. I'm an Amazon. My name's Cosby. First of all, I feel the same way. I'm kind of fangirling. Your books changed my life. I have bipolar and OCD, and it's incredible to be able to hear you speak, and so thank you very much. I'm an English teacher in Baltimore City, and I have a question about sort of coming out to my students especially. I have been a huge advocate for mental illness awareness and suicide prevention in my high school. My principal has not responded favorably to that. She, sort of makes comments about how I have too many feelings, or, if I try to get help for a student who is exhibiting symptoms, she brushes it off or doesn't respond at all. And I try to go through other avenues to get help. So my question is, I'm very open with my students. They respond well to me for a lot of other ways in which I'm open with them. And they all know I have OCD, because that's kind of more of an approachable thing, and we can sort of laugh about it. But bipolar for my students is like an adjective that they use to like tease each other. If somebody's moody one day, they're like, "What are you, bipolar?" So I address it in a way that I say, like, that's not an adjective, that's an illness. And we talk about it that way. But what do you think about me, saying to them, I have bipolar? Like, I don't want to cross any lines, but
A couple things. One is, I would say it's a very individual decision, and it's the sort of thing you'd have to take on with colleagues, peers, family, principal, law. Secondly, just as a general reaction, I never told any of my patients, I never would have told any of my patients. I think that, I think that there's a line, a professional line, where that's just one person's view, because there are other people who disagree with that completely. I have always felt that a patient has a right to walk into my office with a sense of dealing with his or her own problems, and not with their expectations of how I might be dealing with them. It gets things a bit muddied, and I know that there are some lawsuits in education about this. As I say, people disagree with that, but I think the anonymity and the role of teacher, role of professor, role of therapist or priest is probably something that people are going to disagree about. You can have very strong feelings about it, and I wouldn't be in a position to do that. I know that when residents or medical students ask me about it, about whether or not they should be open on applications, I always say be really circumspect, because a lot of people are really understanding and a lot of people are really not understanding. And if there are 100 people competing for the same job, there are a lot of reasons you can come up with for not giving a slot in a residency program, and you don't have to ever mention the word mental illness.
Right.
So that's just a very somewhat jaundiced view of having been around the block on this particular issue. I mean, I just don't think it's anybody's business. I don't think it's anybody's business on a residency application to be talking about all their psychiatric problems. I mean, I personally get rid of a lot of those forms anyway, but I'm not sure that that's my business. If I'm sitting on the admissions committee at Hopkins for the medical school, I'm not sure that it's my business to be passing judgment one way or another on people's psychological issues. I want to know if they're going to be a good doctor.
right.
That's.
Okay. But you don't think it's dishonest for me to?
I don't think it's dishonest. I think it's, by and large, as I say, this is my view. I think it's professional to keep a distance.
Okay.
But that's just, again, there are people who would disagree with that for good reasons, I'm sure. But, Yeah, no, I wouldn't say that it's dishonest. No, I would say it's private, you know. I think people have a right to their private lives.
Good morning, Dr. Jameson. My name is Patricia Summers, and I'm from Washington County, Hagerstown, Maryland. And I am currently in mental health, and my 15-year-old is also. And at this point in time, she stopped taking her medication. And her therapist and I said, well, why are you not taking your medication? Because someone has put in her head that you take medication, that means you're crazy. So she tells me, I'm not crazy, I'm not taking this medication, but she's everywhere, she's all over the place. And now she's smoking marijuana. She won't take her medicine. I don't know what else to do for her.
It's the single most difficult thing about treating bipolar illness is getting people, A, into treatment, B, keeping them in treatment, and keeping them on medication. Very complicated, particularly with young people. My recommendation would be there are really great, advocacy groups like NAMI and DMDA that are out there that have parents groups. And you can get a lot of good ideas and support from parents groups. I think, they've been around with that kind of situation. It's terribly hard to do, to deal with somebody who's young, who doesn't want to take medications for a lot of reasons, not just that one. But
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Try to be as brief as possible. My name is Ebony. And first off, I've never heard of you before, but thank you for your presentation. What struck me in your presentation was when you brought up the college student population. And I say that because my first time being diagnosed with anything was anxiety disorder the week before I started college. I thought I had the flu. And I remember being there and trying to promote mental health advocacy, and I really had a hard time. So my question to you is, how would you, as far as, like I said, college students, what are, I guess, some ways to, promote advocacy through the college population, like that students can want to talk about it,
Sure. I mean, there are a couple of great groups that are out there. There's a group called Active Minds, and they try, across, they're like maybe 400 campuses now across America, and they work very hard to educate and talk about mental illness I think, again, going back a little bit earlier to parents, educating parents, pediatricians have made really good inroads in talking to parents about depression, not so much bipolar illness, which actually tends to occur often a little bit earlier. And I think people should read. I think colleges should spend a little bit more time in their orientation programs on this, because this is what's going to cause kids academic problems, social problems, problem of their life, misery, unhappiness. It's going to be depression and related disorders on campus. And so I think it's, again, a question of you all are here for public health reasons in a way of working in communities. And I think the importance of working with communities and getting communities to work with parents is really, really key.
Well, thank you, and thank you for promoting through that population.
Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Jameson. I want to thank you so very much for your presentation here, for having this community conversation. You opened the door for me this morning when I was coming in, and I did not know that it was you. But years ago, I had read your book, The Unquiet Mind, and when I read it, it was like an autobiography for me, because I can relate to it so extremely much. I work here at the University of Maryland at the Walter P. Carter Center in Community Psychiatry, and it was a requirement for my job to have that I have a mental illness. And I am the consumer advocate for the PAC team. And I had onset of my mental illness when I was in my early 20s, and I'm in my 60s now. And over the years, it was just, my journey with mental illness has been really a rocky journey, but eventually I was diagnosed properly with bipolar disorder, and I was put on lithium. And I've had various doctors, various diagnoses, in and out many hospitals, and I eventually was stabilized and was able to work. So eventually, God bless, I was employable, and have been in treatment. And my recent doctor is in-house, who's been I received excellent care. Dr. Weintraub, my boss, has gone through a lot with me because of not just my mental illness, but with physical conditions as well. And God be the glory, I'm still employed, and I've met you in the past at another conference years ago, and I have highly admired and respected you until now. I've learned a lot from you with the work that you're doing, and that has really caused me to hang in there, roll with the punches, don't give up. And I've always said and tried to encourage the clients that we work with, don't give up, don't give out, just give it your all. And I encourage the clients to take their medication. We can't force it on you, but from my experiences, medication will help you. A mental illness is not a death sentence. It's an illness. There's no cure to date for mental illness, but it can be treated. You have a choice, whether you take medication and get help and be able to function, or you don't take your medicine and continue to be sick. But you can recover from mental illness, and your recovery will be ongoing.
I'm glad you're in the job you're in. That's wonderful.
My
Yeah.
boss, she may be here,
Yeah.
Mrs. Yolanda Jones. She's fabulous. And thank you ever so much just for you.
Well, thank you.
God bless you all.
Thank you all.
Dr. Jameson, on behalf of all of us, let me say thank you for the time that you have given, for the personal stories that you have shared. Several have mentioned, as did Dr. Jameson, An Unquiet Mind. I read it. It is very personal, deeply powerful, incredibly important, and I would commend it.
Short.
And it is short, but power in short. And I would commend it to each and every one of you. Will you please once more say thank you to her for this tremendous job? Terrific.
So again, I'm Jill Rockbeisel, and I'm so happy to welcome you to the next segment of our program. That is a panel of experts who will present to you signs and symptoms of some of the most common mental health disorders that affects so many people, and you've heard this already this morning, but I can't help but say it again, affects individuals in this room, our friends, our families, our neighbors, so many people around us. For this segment, we will have 4 brief presentations by experts in the field, followed by questions. I encourage you, again, to write the questions on the index cards if for any reason, only reason to remember them from speaker to speaker. When we've heard all of the presentations, I invite you to come to the mic for questions, or you can pass your cards to the end and we will field questions that way as well. So let us begin. Our first panelist is Ms. Grace Serafini. Ms. Serafini is the Director of Nursing for the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Maryland St. Joseph's Medical Center and has been there for the past 20 years. And for many years, she's focused her attention, in addition to other topics, on mood disorders. She will speak to us today about major depression, bipolar disorder, and anxiety disorders. Ms. Serafini.
Thank you for microphone. Thank you for hosting us here today. So I'm going to talk about a series of disorders, mood disorders as well as anxiety disorders. And Dr. Jamison's talk was wonderful, and I was hoping, oh, don't do my talk, because she was talking about some of the symptomatology of these diseases, and that's what my talk's about. It will be brief. So mood disorders are also known as affective disorders, and they're a set of psychiatric diseases. The main types of affective disorders are depression, bipolar disorder, and a series of disorders called anxiety disorders. And typically, all of these disorders affect your mood and your function. And I just want to impress upon you that there are times where people feel anxious, people feel sad, people feel manic or happy. But this is a disease state that impacts your function. So your ability to go to work, your ability to be a student, your ability to be a parent, your ability to be in community with your colleagues or your friends. So that's the key difference between having some feeling states and disease. So first, let's talk about major depression. Again, generally, these symptoms need to be present for about a 2-week period of time for them to be classified as major depression. And they affect a variety of areas in your life. The first is your energy level. So generally with depression, people's energy level is very low. They're not able to do the things energetically as they had been doing before. There's also a feeling state of worthlessness and guilt. People feel tremendous guilt and worry and feeling as if they're not worth being alive today. And that is an internal feeling state that people have with major depression. Dr. Jamison referred to this in terms of poor concentration and difficulty making decisions. Often this impacts your ability to function at work, your ability to read, function at school, or pay attention to the things that you need to do. And so your concentration is significantly impaired when you have major depression. Sleep is impaired, and it's a shame that sleep is impaired because that's one of the most important things for all of us is to get good sleep. And with sleep, it's either getting too much sleep, where you're sleeping all the time, or not enough sleep. And that not enough sleep might look like difficulty falling asleep at night. Waking up in the middle of the night, perhaps worrying, perhaps feeling guilty, perhaps having thoughts in your head that are negative. Or early morning awakening. Now, some of us get up early, 6 a.m., 7 a.m., 5 a.m., but this would be an early morning of 3 a.m., 4 a.m., when you wouldn't normally be waking up. And oftentimes, when you are waking up, there's a sense of worry there. There's a loss of interest in pleasure in most activities, and so those things that you used to enjoy, you no longer enjoy, and you no longer make an effort to do. So if you have a sports activity that you enjoy or a card game that you enjoy, you don't have the energy or desire to do that anymore. People with depression feel restless at times or slowed down. And so we have clinical terms for that: psychomotor retardation, meaning you're more slowed down, or psychomotor agitation, meaning that you really can't sit still and you have this inner anxiety and tension that you can't release. And that is a symptom of depression. And then significant weight loss or gain. So food and appetite are impacted by depression. You no longer enjoy the foods that you used to enjoy. You stop eating, or you eat too much and gain weight. So it could go, again, either way. And a lot of these symptoms are what we call vegetative symptoms. These are things that we do every day and need to do every day. And when they're working normally, we're all doing well. But if they're not working normally, then that is potentially a sign of depression. And the most, I think, difficult symptom that we manage and usually what brings people to care is the thoughts of death and suicide. And if anybody's been to a hospital recently, you'll find that we're asking everybody, regardless of why you come in, whether you've had thoughts of suicide, because people aren't asking that question enough. My hope is that your primary care providers are asking that question as well, so that it opens the conversation around depression. So that assessment is something that's being required in some of our areas so that we get to more people who have these symptoms. So these thoughts of suicide may be fleeting, where they come and go, or they may be recurrent, or they may be to the point where people are making a plan about dying and how they might succeed in that plan. And so again, having several of these symptoms, including the suicidality, gives you the diagnosis of depression. Next, I'd like to talk about bipolar disorder. And I want to impress upon you with bipolar disorder, usually it's a cycling of your mood up and down. And so the down part looks very much like major depression. The up part looks a little different. It is called mania. And these are some of the symptoms of that. And so doing things you later regret, perhaps spending too much money, engaging in reckless sexual activity, gambling excessively, or being argumentative with people who normally you wouldn't be arguing with. Finding it hard to stay focused. People with mania oftentimes have a hard time staying focused on a conversation. There's this symptom state called hypomania, which is a very interesting symptom state. It's the level below this, and oftentimes when people are hypomanic, they're incredibly creative and energetic and really do a lot of things, and sometimes very successfully. However, when we move into the manic realm, which are these symptoms, people are no longer successful because the focus is gone. They may be having lots of thoughts in their head that are coming very quick, as if your thoughts are racing, your mind is racing. I'm not doing this. People generally talk faster than normal. I generally talk fast, so I'm trying to slow myself down here. People talk faster than usual when they have mania. And oftentimes those thoughts that are coming out of their mouth are loosely connected, so that you might have a hard time or might feel you need to concentrate very hard to understand what they're saying. And sometimes they lose touch with reality with those thoughts, meaning they may be expressing things that Dr. Jameson talked about, delusions, thinking they are very important human beings and that they have a mission in life to do something very special that may be out of proportion what their real function is supposed to be. So that could be that part of losing touch with reality. Sometimes, and Dr. Jameson referred to this, people do use substances to manage their mood states and feelings, and they sometimes do this with mania. But there are times where somebody may appear as if they're using substances because of the way they're behaving, and in fact they're not. They have this disease of mania, bipolar disorder. And then finally, and this is often what gets people into the hospital, people take dangerous risks or put themselves in unsafe situations that lead them to being hospitalized. And sometimes there are encounters with police that require intervention, and that often results in somebody coming to the emergency room for evaluation to determine whether mania is the problem. Okay. So that was quickly on mood disorders, depression and bipolar disorders. And now I'd like to speak a bit about anxiety disorders. There are 5 different types of anxiety disorders. They're all sort of in the same class and family. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them, and then I'm going to go through some basic symptoms for these diseases. So first, social anxiety disorder would be anxiety that's experienced when you're in social situations. And so this, talking to a crowd of 300, may be precipitating anxiety in some, and someone may not be able to do this type of talk because they have social anxiety and aren't able to speak in front of crowds. It could be that people aren't even able to go to parties or events where there'll be more than just close friends there. So that may look like social anxiety disorder. There's generalized anxiety disorder that isn't necessarily related to social situations. And so there's a perception and feeling of anxiety all the time that doesn't go away, and sometimes doesn't even go away when you're at rest or at sleep. There are phobias. Phobias are, fear of doing something. Some people have phobias of crossing the Bay Bridge. Some people have phobias or fears of heights. Some people have phobias or fears of spiders or different types of bugs. And people have fears, people have worries, but to the point where I will not go to Ocean City or cross the Bay Bridge with my phobia because I have a panic attack and anxiety as I approach that bridge, and I have to get in the back seat or get a driver to get me across the bridge. That would be a phobia of crossing the Bay Bridge. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, there will be a talk this afternoon around violence, and that'll be an important talk for all of you to hear around post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a disease, an anxiety disorder, but often it is triggered by an event. And there are thoughts that people have a genetic predisposition to anxiety that lead them to experience post-traumatic stress disorder when they experience an event that someone else might experience and not have any anxiety from. And there are thoughts that an event is traumatic sufficiently to cause post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, this often has symptomatology around flashbacks, panic attacks, when you have these recurrent thoughts about the stressor that you have experienced. And that stressor could be domestic violence. That stressor could be our neighborhood here in West Baltimore and the violence our children experience, seeing what happens with drugs here. It could be someone who's a war veteran, and it could be someone having witnessed something that was traumatic, or a house fire that was traumatic for them. And then lastly is obsessive-compulsive disorder. And obsessive-compulsive disorder is a disease state, and it is triggered, has a genetic predisposition, and the two components are obsessions, thoughts in my head that I'm worried about, and then compulsions, things I need to do to calm those thoughts in my head. And so something around OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, may be that people need to check the stove to make sure it's off before they leave the house. But it's not just me checking the stove and leaving. It's me checking the stove, getting to the door and realizing, did I check the stove, and going back, and to the point where I'm paralyzed and cannot leave the house because I need to watch the stove and make sure it stays off. So that would be the degree to which OCD may impact somebody's life, in that they have to do these repetitive activities to manage their anxiety about their obsessions. So that's, in a nutshell, what each of those are. But I wanted to go over some of the symptoms that each of them can have and display. So feelings of panic, fear, and uneasiness. And this isn't just, oh, I'm scared to give a talk today. This is, I can't give this talk because my heart is racing. I'm having palpitations, to the point I might think I'm having a heart attack. And oftentimes people come into the hospital, into the emergency department with, sweaty palms, shortness of breath, and heart palpitations, and those symptoms are very much like a heart attack, sorry to say. And so we in the ERs will work somebody up for heart attack and find that there aren't any clinical symptomatology of that, and then perhaps approach the subject of perhaps you're having some type of anxiety or panic attack right now. And so this is what it might feel like. People with anxiety often have problems sleeping. They have sweaty hands, shortness of breath, heart beating fast. Some aren't able to stay still or stay calm. You have a dry mouth, nausea, dizziness, a numbness and tingling in your feet or hands, and overall muscle tension. And then within this, panic attacks to the point where you're experiencing all of this at the same time and can't move. And it may look very frightening to somebody who's watching you experiencing the panic. I'm done. Okay, well done. All right.
Terrific. Thank you, Grace. That's a lot of information. Again, write your questions down. We'll come back to them at the end. Our second special as panelist is Dr. Curtis Adams, who has for the past 19 years devoted his career to working with individuals with serious and persistent mental illness. Dr. Adams is also the Vice President for the American Academy of Community Psychiatrists and has done a phenomenal amount of work, particularly bringing trainees and educating people about community life and mental illness. He will talk to us today about the signs and symptoms of psychosis and the commonly associated disorders that we think about when we think about psychosis. Dr. Adams.
Good morning. Oh, nice crowd. Very good. All right. Again, yeah, I'm a Vice President of the American Association of Community Psychiatrists. And what we are is a group of psychiatrists who are recovery-oriented, and we offer person-centered care and systems-based practice. And what that ultimately means, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, is that we recognize that the illnesses that we treat are not fixed by medications alone. And I'll talk some about how that might impact some of the psychoses, for example. Okay. In sort of the colloquial sense, you'll hear someone has said to have lost touch with reality. And oftentimes those persons have psychosis. And psychosis can be a small portion of what happens with a person, or it can be a large portion. And so it can be very brief, hours, moments. It can be temporary, days, and it can be a persistent part of an illness. And a component of an illness, not the entire illness. So, what can cause psychosis? Stress. Any one of us under enough stress and in the right circumstances can have psychotic symptoms. And I see enough gray hair in the room to know that there are some people here who remember when radio DJs used to do radiothons. Anyone remember those? So, a radiothon for people who are much younger. The DJ would be on for 24 or 48 straight hours, talking, blabbering, playing records. Records, well, ask your parents. I'm not going into that. Man, oh man. Anyway, and so what would happen with a number of those DJs is that 24 or 36 hours in, they start to get a little paranoid and very paranoid. And these are people who didn't have psychotic illness as a part of their past, but the stress was enough to do that. And so you put people under enough stress, and they're at risk for that. So sleep deprivation is an example of something that can cause it. More commonly today, substances of abuse can cause psychotic symptoms. Cocaine for some people can cause paranoia. For some, cannabis. And for some people with schizophrenia, for example, cannabis can be one of the worst and most likely to cause psychotic symptoms. It can be a very difficult disorder. And for us who are graying, the cannabis of 20 years ago is not the cannabis of today. And it's much, much more potent and much more likely to cause these kinds of problems. So it's not something to be taken lightly by any stretch of the imagination. Not so much around here, but in certain communities. So for instance, in the gay male community in this area, methamphetamine can be a problem and can cause psychotic symptoms as an example. There are other substances as well. For, again, folks who are gray, they can remember the epidemic of PCP in this area. There's still some around, and it can still cause some psychotic symptoms, but it's just not nearly as popular as it used to be, I guess fortunately. I'm sorry. And in addition, with regard to cannabis, what I didn't mention also is the synthetic cannabinoids. We'll probably have some more conversation about that. But there are perhaps 250 synthetic lab-created cannabis-like substances. One of the bigger challenges with these with these substances in this area is that we cannot test for it because it doesn't show up on our drug screens. unless you do a specific drug screen. And the average garden variety testing in an emergency room will not pick these up, but they are popular and prevalent and are causing psychotic symptoms, and on occasion can cause a person to be as psychotic as a person you would see who had consumed PCP. Having seen both eras, it's a very significant concern. Okay. So I mentioned some substances and stress as a cause of psychotic symptoms. There are also illnesses with which psychosis is a small or large component. Not the entire illness, but it's a part of the illness. So schizophrenia being one of them. Schizoaffective disorder, which is somewhat similar, where a person has both psychotic symptoms and mood or affective symptoms that we heard about a little while ago. There are people whose depression is so severe that they will have psychotic symptoms as well. And then also with bipolar disorder, with either the manic side or the depressed side, or even in what we call the mixed state, where a person has both symptoms of mania and depression running either at the same time or nearly at the same time. So I've talked about the TURB in general, but what are some of the features? Commonly, people with psychosis have hallucinations. And what a hallucination is, it's a sensory symptom in the absence of a stimulus. So if the room is entirely quiet and I'm hearing conversation coming from outside of my head that sounds like I'm wearing headphones, that would be an auditory hallucination. And and if the room is quiet, that means that there's no stimulus, and so I shouldn't normally be hearing that, but because I'm having this symptom, either fleeting or long-lasting, I'm having that experience of the auditory hallucination. And they can be of various types. People will hear encouraging things, but a lot of times they hear negative things, particularly if you're having this symptom when you're depressed. It can be, just go ahead and kill yourself. It can be telling you negative things because it sort of fits with your mood, so the hallucination is in that experience. There are some times when patients have talked about them being funny and they'll laugh out loud because of what they're hearing. And as I said, it can occur in any of the five senses. So you can hear things, people see things. Hearing is the most common probably, and that's what we most ask about, but it can be in all five senses. So people see things, see people, see shadows, have it on the skin, related to either substance use or schizophrenia, for example. You can feel like someone's touching you or posing you. I had a gentleman who, his first psychotic symptom that he could recall was smelling peppermint, which is fine, except that he was in his grandmother's kitchen and there was no peppermint in the room, and so he was able to work his way back and determine that that was actually an hallucination. So it was what we call an olfactory hallucination, but it was through his nose. And so are people who say that they're hearing voices? The answer is yes. Because the apparatus through which we perceive anything through any of the five senses is the brain. And the brain gets stimulated, and then it creates this. And so if you're not sure about how that might work, for example, all you have to do is remember a dream, and that you're asleep and your eyes are closed, but you're seeing things. And so are you really seeing things? Yeah, you absolutely are. And sometimes you might be hitting your spouse because of what you see. But that's never happened to me. But but the brain is active in those areas, and so in fact they are hearing or seeing or feeling or tasting or touching these things, or feeling touched. So part of that point of that is that we can't talk people out of that because they're actually experiencing these things. Okay. Now, some people can recognize that their hallucinations are not real, and I'm just sort of contradicting myself. And what I mean by that is that they see it as alien, as not natural. I don't know why I'm hearing something. That does not make any sense. And for some, when it mixes in with the delusion, it is something that they feel sure about. So for instance, I have a lady I work with who feels like people are touching her. So she has a hallucination on the skin. She feels being touched. And then she has a story about who might be doing this and what their reasons are. And so they both fit, and so it's actually happening to her. It can happen even though the person is miles away. She feels it, and she's sure that that person is able to do it. Okay. Also, so another psychotic symptom, delusions. And these are fixed beliefs, they're false, and they don't match with a person's culture. And all three components of that are important, because we all have fixed beliefs about things. I believe the sky is blue. That's not going to change much, and no one's going to convince me otherwise. But people who hold a delusion may hold that view, hold their view as strongly as I hold the view that the sky is blue. False, and then not in keeping with the culture. So I can't say I've seen any of these TV shows with zombies, but fair enough. But there are cultures, for example, where people believe that zombies exist. And so if someone says they've been having experiences or contact with zombies and the community believes that, then it's not a delusion necessarily, because it's part of the culture. So and that's really what's important for a lot of these disorders in general, but in delusion in particular. There are cultural influences that make it so that this is not a psychotic symptom. Okay, all kinds of delusions. Paranoid, people are after you, the conspiracies by the CIA, FBI, all at the same time. Grandiose. I had a guy who believed he was Jesus and walked on water and then walked in a swimming pool and fell in. But then he also did a lot of walking, and so he ended up blisters on his feet and said, see, I did walk on water. Blisters being water, folks. And also delusions of misidentification, for example, which is those people are not my parents have been kidnapped. It's really a tough situation, particularly for family members, because they're trying to help their child with their illness, and the misidentification symptoms are saying, no, they're not my parent. So let me go quickly. Brief, so duration of psychosis, brief, and I talked about that earlier. For instance, if it's the DJ who's been up all night, get him sleep, get him rest, usually guys who are foolish enough to do this, and then they feel better and the psychosis goes away. Oftentimes with substance-induced psychosis, oftentimes, not always, abstinence leads to resolution of symptoms. And then for some people with manic depressive illness or major depression, when their mood is more normalized, they don't have the psychotic symptoms anymore, so it's, Now, for some, it's a persistent part of their illness. And medication can help a lot with the symptoms, but it doesn't take away all of the problems associated with the illness. Common disorders associated with psychosis, as I said, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and then sometimes with major depression and bipolar illness, people have persistent symptoms. Talked about some of that a moment ago. So treatment is not just, for instance, with a person with schizophrenia, treatment is not just biological. So it's not just medications, and if you take your medications, everything's going to be okay. No, it's biological. They need therapy and psychological supports. They also need social interventions. I work with a gentleman who, we had all kinds of meds. He was in and out of hospital and out of hospital. The thing that made the difference and helped him the most was going to a clubhouse where he got support, got peer support. Don't know what it was about that, but it worked, and it was extremely helpful. People with schizophrenia quickly have the hallucinations, have the delusions, can have the disorganized thinking where their thoughts don't go from A to B to C to D to E, may go A to F to Z to J, all over. And their behavior that may match that disorganization. And the hugest problem for a lot of people in the social realm with schizophrenia are the negative symptoms. Negative symptoms being problems with drive, energy, motivation, and ambition. The illness takes that away from them, and so they don't have a social network. It's hard to get up and go to work. It's hard to connect with other people. It's hard to do what the rest of us do, and that's probably the most disabling. There are people who can work with hallucinations. It's very, very hard when you have no drive, no energy, no motivation, no ambition. Okay? All right. And so as a consequence, for a person with schizophrenia, for example, medications help. But I tell my residents, medications will fix about 10% of what the person faces. The other 90% is the psychosocial. So it's the psychological interventions, the social interventions. It's not a purely psychotic illness. We don't have any medicines that are anti-schizophrenia. We have antipsychotic medications. We don't have anti-schizophrenia medicines, not a single one, because it's a multi-pronged illness and multiple problems. Okay? All right. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. Our third panelist is Dr. Carnell Cooper, a professor of surgery at the University of Maryland School of Medicine and also serving as Senior VP Chief Medical Officer at the PG County Hospital. In 1998, after coming in contact with so many victims of violence and trauma while working at the University of Maryland Shock Trauma Center, Dr. Cooper founded the Violence Intervention Program to work with individuals exposed to extreme violence and trauma. Dr. Cooper will talk to us today about the impact of such trauma. Dr. Cooper.
Good morning, everyone. So until a few moments ago, I didn't realize I should have anxiety when I'm talking to you guys. So let's talk a little bit about just the impact of violence in general. And you can see here that there are 39 people murdered each day, 180 are shot, 2,000 children are abused, 127,000 hurt by others, and 117 commit suicide. So violence is an issue that, again, we as a society talk a lot about, but it's a huge problem for us. 6,000 lives are lost each year, 490,000 years of life are lost due to violence. $450 billion is spent on it, and countless people are exposed to it, and it's with enduring effects. If you look at it, and I choose, and many others choose to look at violence as a disease. You can see that it spreads similar to things like cholera, influenza. But what I really want to focus on is the way it's transmitted. And you can see here that it's transmitted to exposure, modeling, social learning norms. This is a very important slide here. And if you look at exposure to violence and violence, you can see that the more that you're exposed to, the more likely you are to exhibit violent behavior. This is looking at child abuse victims. 30% of all child abuse victims become abusers. If you look at the slides here, that exposure, this is after the World War II in one countries that had this is again looking at probability of exposure and moderate exposure versus chronic exposure, and again the probability of perpetrating violent behavior. So again, exposure to violence begets more violent behavior. And finally, here in the bottom slide here, this is community violence after wars. And see, this is the number of countries that had an increase in violence after wars versus the number that decreased. The orange being the number of countries that had an increase in violence after wars, and the blue being those who did not. And you can see again, there was most importantly an increase in violence and abuse after the World War I and World War II. So again, social learning and modeling is an important part of why we our kids, our adults exhibit violent behavior. In our communities, if it's the norm, then it's going to become the way our communities function. And so if we're going to impact these kinds of behavior, we have to impact our behavior. We have to impact what has become the norm in these communities. In communities which violence is a way of life, there's hypersensitization, there's hyperarousal sensation, there's stress. If fights, if gunshots going off in the middle of the night are part of your community, it becomes a stressful situation. That, along with the lack of jobs, the lack of other community resources, all add to a situation in which the incidence of violence goes up. And again, these are some of the logical effects that I'm sure that our behavioral health providers can talk about a bit more. If you look at violence as a social determinant of behavior, look at education, there's diminished performance, there's lower attendance, there's decreased graduation rates. Economically, there's reduced business investments, there's reduced commercial activity in those communities. The healthcare, of course, in those communities is higher because of the violence. Oh, I'm sorry, I should talk a little more to the mic again. There are unsafe public places that leads to decreased usage. The more resources are used resources to public safety, and of course, because of the high demand due to the trauma. And this, again, reduced cohesion and sense of collective efficacy in those communities. Again, violence leads to more violence. If you look at impoverished communities, there's chronic unemployment, drugs and weapons use is available, gangs, violence, and gangs, crime, and violence becomes behavioral norms. There's institutionalized prejudice and racism. Those communities, again, these kinds of things lead to more violence. Impoverished schools, the underfunding, a lack of resources, disorganization, limited enrichment courses, zero tolerance. Again, all of these are the kinds of things in those communities that lead to increased violence. And when we looked at, we started looking at this, as was noted in the 1990s, and we asked a very simple questions. What are the things that lead to increase repeat victims of violence? So the Shock Trauma Center has an incredible record of taking care of patients, and that was especially true when it came to patients admitted from motor vehicle crashes and falls and blunt kinds of injuries. But when we looked at patients admitted for violent injuries, what we saw was there was a significant increase of recidivism in those patients. So ask a very simple question, why is that? The same wasn't true of patients who were admitted for, again, motor vehicle crashes and falls. And so we did a study comparing patients admitted for motor vehicle crashes and falls and non-violent injuries, compared them to patients who were admitted to the hospital because, for a second or third time, because of violent injuries. And I'm just presenting you data that looked at the history of abuse. And you can see here that there was the patients under the blue slides were patients who were the repeat victims of violence who were admitted, and the yellow blocks were the patients who were admitted because of, again, fall, motor vehicle crash, et cetera. And you can see there is an insignificant increase in those patients who were admitted because of emotional abuse, and those patients who were admitted for victims of violence. There was increased history of physical abuse in those patients who were admitted because of a violent injury, and increased incidence of sexual abuse. We looked at a whole lot of other things as well. We looked at income, graduation from school, et cetera. And again, there was deleterious effects on all those patients that were admitted because of as repeat victims of violence. Again, this is just some data looking at parents and immediate family history, and again, looking at just, again, the blue being those patients admitted because of as repeat victims of violence versus those for motor vehicle crashes. And you can see there was an increased history of alcohol abuse, increased history of drug use, more likely to be admitted for patient psychiatric care, and family members more likely to have been imprisoned. So with that data, we ask a very simple question. What can we do to decrease these patients from coming back to our hospital? And we simply said, well, let's put together a program that addresses these issues. Let's put a program that looks at them when they come into the hospital. Let's ask questions. Do they have a history of substance abuse? What is their income? What kinds of communities do they live in? Did they get their GED? Did they get their diploma? And let's sort of meet them where they are and begin to address these issues. And this is the next slide. It's a very complex slide, but essentially, I won't go into details, but essentially the first phase was was essentially stabilization. While the patient's in the hospital, making sure that that we are asking questions not about just their injuries, but about the history of substance abuse or the history of their graduation from high school, et cetera. And then with recovery and rehabilitation, helping them get through the process of recovery. What kinds of things do they need as they leave the hospital? Do they have a safe place to go if they were a victim of domestic violence, for example? And then beginning to look at life skills, beginning to get them in the job training programs, beginning to get them into GED development programs, and finally self-preservation, having them move from our program back into their communities, having them get into jobs, get into things that will move them forward. This is just one slide of some of the data from that study. And the goal of this study was to keep patients from coming back to our hospital with violent injuries. And essentially, just again, this is the intervention group versus non-intervention group here. And essentially, this is looking at just hospitalizations and the cost. And essentially, you can see at the end of 3 years, we asked the question, how many patients were readmitted to the hospital because of a violent injury, who got our intervention versus those who did not. And essentially, there were 3 patients who came back to the hospital because of another injury. And again, it was because of violent injury, not a car crash the second time. It was a violent injury. Versus, an intervention group, and the non-intervention group, 16 patients. So it significantly decreased the number of patients who came back to our hospital with violent injury. And of course, not surprisingly, the cost was, the savings was significant. There are now approximately 32 programs around the country, including Canada, South America, and England, who are doing similar work, again, addressing the issues of mental, of physical, educational, mental health once they come to the hospital. I'm going to end with this slide here. The question that we are still trying to get at is really what is the role of behavioral health and perpetrators of what is the instance? How often is this a factor? And how do we diagnose it? How do we treat it? How do we manage it? Across the EDs and every morning in our state, there are tons of patients sitting in our EDs who need behavioral health. We don't have the resources for a lot of those patients. It's especially true for our young folks. So we're currently doing a study looking at all our patients that admit to our hospital for violent injuries and doing a screen of them, trying to assess them for behavioral health issues. I'm hoping that we'll have that study out and about in a couple of years and be able to have a better feel for how not only the incidence of these kinds of issues in our violent injured patients, but is our program impacting their behavior as well. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wow, lots of information. Our fourth and final panelist is Dr. Eric Weintraub, a board-certified addiction psychiatrist who's also the director of our Division of Alcohol and Drug Addiction here in the School of Medicine. Dr. Weintraub has spent more than 20 years working with individuals with substance use disorders and has spent a tremendous amount of time and energy exploring the challenges of engagement and treatment. Most recently, Dr. Weintraub has focused on the state of Maryland's opioid epidemic, exploring novel approaches to outreach and treatment. Dr. Weintraub will talk to us about the opioid problem, the relationship to pain, and the resulting increase in number of persons with addiction.
Thank you, Jill, and welcome everyone. I'm just not sure if I have the right slides here, so I'm trying to think.
Where'd you put it? Where's our guy?
Website's right.
What's that? I know, but I had it like on my desktop.
Where's our AV guy? Is that the right?
Well, we'll see what happens.
Okay.
If not, I'll have to pull them up. So thank you, and again, welcome everyone. This is you know, obviously addiction covers a wide range of disorders and substances. Dr. Adams spoke about cannabis, cannabinoids, and synthetics, but we're in such a crisis here with our opioid epidemic that I thought maybe we should focus on that and try to figure out how we got to the point where we are and maybe what we can do to try to work our way out of this. Basically, when we're talking about the slide here and talking about people's substance use disorders and opioid use disorders, we're talking about people that have real dependence, that have their lives focused on obtaining opioids, and it precludes them from living a meaningful life because they spend most of their day chasing drugs and using them. So we're talking about probably 2.5 million Americans that now are suffering from this disorder. Most of them are actually addicted to pain medicines and not heroin. And obviously, there's a huge cost to society right now. Not only does it have an individual cost, so people are dying of overdoses, developing very significant disorders where they can't work and do the jobs, but it also affects society. People are showing up in emergency rooms, getting hospitalized, and repeatedly, and it's just a significant burden to society if we cannot help these people get on track. Things started actually probably in the 80s, 90s. This started to be a burgeoning problem. This Time magazine cover actually came out in June of 2015, and things are still escalating to this point. We're going to go through some numbers that show just how devastating things are right now. But one of the big problems is, and we're going to talk about how this happened, is there's just too many prescription medications being out there right now. So basically, 2012, there was one bottle of opioid medications prescribed for each person in this country, each adult person. And it's still going on. I did actually a grand rounds at Laurel Regional last week, and a doctor was telling me a story of somebody that came in for a small foot problem, like an infection. He got 30 days of prescription medications. And this is during a time where we're being warned not to prescribe so many medications. The other problem is this is a North American issue. It's more located in the United States and Canada. Most Western European countries are seeing a decrease in opioid use because they don't prescribe as many of these medications. And I think I have, so this just shows a slide of just how many more opioids have been prescribed since 1991. It just keeps rising. And there's a connection between rise in opioid prescribing, addiction, and overdose deaths. This is the slide I was talking about. 99% of all hydrocodone is prescribed in the United States, 80% of all oxycodone, and 65% of hydromorphone or Dilaudid, just in this country. And we make up about 4% of the world's population. These are just staggering numbers. 91 people dying every day. Every single day, 91 people die of an overdose. And now, the deaths from overdoses are exceeding those from firearms or motor vehicle accidents. So it's the most common cause of death in younger people. It always used to be people dying from people are still dying in that way. As Dr. Cooper said, there's still a lot of violence, but this has overcome that. And they've quadrupled, the overdose deaths have quadrupled since the late 90s. You can see that heroin use is actually rising. Opioid prescription pain medicine use is staying about the same. A lot of people are switching from opioid pain medications to heroin because it's cheaper and more easily available and easier to get. This just shows kind of the red areas or the areas. So it's a lot of the increase in drug use has been in Appalachia areas, but you can see Maryland is up there too. We're kind of in the second tier of the increases in opioid deaths and opioid use. This is clearly a problem in Maryland, as I just said. In March 1st, Governor Hogan declared a state of emergency in the state of Maryland for the opioid crisis. And this is why. I mean, if you look at the numbers, it's just staggering. From 2011 to 2016, the deaths from heroin-related deaths have gone up almost 5 times. And from fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, which is probably the thing that's most responsible for the increase in opioid deaths because it's so potent. And again, the numbers from 2013 to 2016, it's just incredible that how many people are dying. And I think for those of us that work on the front lines, it's hitting home because we're seeing our patients die now. People were always using, and it wasn't a good thing, but the consequences of using even once could be fatal. And I was sharing, some of my team is here, so one of my patients that I've worked with for the last 10 years actually passed away last week from using, and it's really been difficult for us to watch this. And so anyway, the other issue that Maryland is having is it's really impacting their medical costs. They did a study of emergency usage and inpatient hospitalizations related to opioid use. Maryland, unfortunately, came in number 1 for opioid use utilization, inpatient hospitalizations, and number 2 in emergency room opioid use hospitalizations. And for those that work in the emergency department, we see overdoses coming in every day. It's really a tragedy. And I think there was actually a study that showed that Baltimore, which has always had a bad opioid problem, I mean, opioid addiction used to be an urban problem, but it's become an everywhere problem. So rural areas are being impacted. Men, women, higher socioeconomic classes and lower socioeconomic classes are all being affected equally. But I think they did a study and they showed that Baltimore's rates of emergency room usage was 5 times other major metropolitan areas in the United States. And here's just what I was talking about, sort of about the usage in hospitals. So why is this happening? So I think there's 3 issues. One is the increase in prescription opioid availability, and I'm going to again get into that a little bit more in a minute. There's also been a significant increase in cheap heroin. So it used to be most of the heroin came from Southeast Asia, Afghanistan. Then in the early 80s, it started coming from Colombia. But now Mexico is actually manufacturing and shipping most of the heroin that comes into this country. And the third reason, and I'm going to talk about fentanyl in a little bit more detail, is that there are synthetic high-potency opioids that are being put into the heroin. So people don't even know what they're taking right now. And these synthetic opioids are being made in labs around the world, including in China, and they're being imported into this country. I thought this was a great slide. One of my fellows actually did a talk and showed this, but this is the amount of fentanyl, the synthetic opioid, that equals that amount of heroin. So you can see just small little components of fentanyl, if they're mixed into your heroin, can actually be deadly. And when you talk to people about overdose deaths, it used to be when you died of an overdose of heroin, it took time, and you had time to maybe save someone. They'd be talking for a while, then they would gradually start to nod out, and even then you would have time to maybe do an intervention if someone found them. Now, actually, people are overdosing before the needle comes out of their arm because this medicine is so powerful. A couple other ones. There's another actually synthetic opioid called carfentanil, which is actually used to sedate elephants, and I have a picture of that, and it just shows you how much more powerful it is than even heroin and even fentanyl, and that's actually now being found in the supply, and this is just showing that it's used for to sedate elephants. This is actually a story a couple years ago of 2 13-year-olds, and I think they were in Park City, Utah, and they were able to acquire fentanyl online through China. They took some and they overdosed. Again, they weren't heroin addicts. Why they were buying it, I'm not sure, but people do all sorts of things over the internet without knowledge, and so they passed away. Another thing that's starting to happen is first responders are starting to have problems, and police officers and EMTs, because the synthetic opioids are so powerful. There was a story of a police officer who found a guy with fentanyl in his car. He did everything right. He put on his gloves, took the fentanyl and put it away. But when he was patting the gentleman down, he took his gloves off, and through skin absorption, he overdosed. And he had to get 4 doses of Narcan to reverse that. So it's just, it's becoming a scary thing for first responders and police officers as well. Excuse me, 5 minutes. So why did this happen? And we're partly responsible as physicians for overprescribing, but in the late 80s, 90s, there was actually a push by pain societies basically stating that physicians were under-treating pain. And again, as Dr. Adams said, for those that have been around for a while, there was an enormous pressure. There was a misinterpretation of the data that basically said that if you did not have cancer and you were not drug addicted, if you got put on opioids for pain, you would not get addicted. They actually gave rates of less than 1%, which were based on false information. At the same time, pharmaceutical companies kind of jumped on this, marketing long-acting drugs like OxyContin, and there was a real push to prescribe these medications for pain. I remember all of us having to read pain articles and being criticized if we didn't prescribe enough, and it was actually considered a patient right, and it is that people's pain should be treated appropriately, but not with too much opioids if it's not necessary. Let me go back here. So pain was actually considered the 5th vital sign, in addition to blood pressure, pulse, and respirations. So it was proposed in 95, adopted by the Joint Commission and the VA in 96. OxyContin came out in 1996, and it went from 48 million to 1.1 billion in sales from 96 to 2001. So there was this flood of medications into the market. And it just kind of, I don't think we have time to go into detail, but there's interesting articles if you read, if you look it up on Google, about how this was marketed by the pharmaceutical companies, and doctors began prescribing huge quantities of this. They actually, some of the executives of Purdue were actually charged with falsifying data and not being, and they actually got fined $600 million and went to jail. The other issue is that heroin is much more available at a cheaper price. You can see since 1992, there's been a huge decrease in the price of heroin, which makes that much more available. And I think I was talking to somebody today, we see a lot of patients that get started. It's very different than in the 60s, 70s, where people started with heroin. Now they get prescription pain meds from the shelves, they get addicted to it, then they can't find it, or they get cut off by their doctors, and then somebody will come up and say, hey, I got this will help you with your withdrawal, and the next thing you know, they're treating heroin and they're addicted to heroin. We do have treatments that can help, medication-assisted treatment, which is a combination of medications, counseling, and behavioral therapies. I think as one of the themes of today was stigma or discrimination, even within our own field, there's some discrimination about whether these are good treatments or not. We're talking about methadone, buprenorphine, and also naltrexone is approved. It's very clear from the evidence this is the best treatment for opioid addiction. Some people can do it without taking medicines, but study after study have shown that people on medicines do better in a variety of outcomes, including they're more likely to stay in treatment, they're more likely to stop using opioids, they're less likely to have overdoses, their productivity as citizens also goes way up. And these are the 3 medications that are approved for medication-assisted treatment. Unfortunately, only about 20 to 30% of patients that have opioid addiction have access to these treatments for a variety of reasons. And one of the goals of the federal government and the state government is to improve access to these treatments. Like I said, those treatments were recommended by just basically everybody around, all major health organizations around the world. And Michael Botticelli, who was sort of a great director for the OCNDP. Federal government's drug policy, was a true believer in this treatment, and basically said it was access to this could be the difference between life and death. And I think I'm going to stop there and go for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Whoops. Dr. Weintraub. So what we'll do is go into questions. I invite people to go to the mic, and I also invite people to forward their cards, and we'll try to intersperse it so the people that send cards up get equal time. I did want to start with one question from the last session that was sent up by someone that hadn't been answered. I think this would go to Grace. The question was, anxiety is anxiety a sign of developing disease in teens? That was one of the questions that was asked.
Yes. So, is this on? Yes, good. It can be. And I think what you need to look at with anxiety are what other symptoms are present for teenagers. Sometimes teenagers look a little different than adults in terms of their symptomatology. I believe there's a talk about adolescence and depression in the afternoon for more details for whoever asked that question. So, thank you.
Do we have anyone that wants to come up to the mic? You have plenty of questions, only one. No.
Can I make a comment and a question?
Absolutely.
This is for Dr. Adams. One, I really appreciate you saying that for psychosis and schizophrenia, that medication isn't the do-all and end-all because, therapies, peer support, those kind of things work. I really appreciate that. And I also wanted to know, I've been recently trained by the Hearing Voices Network USA, and I'm wondering if you're familiar with Hearing Voices Network USA or Hearing Voices International and the work they're doing. Thank you.
Sure. I became aware of that network partly by learning about cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis, which does exist. And then there are other people who deal with this. So, for instance, there's the actor Anthony Hopkins who hears voices, and it's part of the Hearing Voices Network. And so one of the things that he does, and he doesn't have schizophrenia, but he hears voices, and there are times when the voices get so loud that they can be disruptive, and so some of the times what he does is he tells them to shut up because I got to do my work. And then gets a break from them. But yeah, absolutely. And part of him being public about it and talking about the Hearing Voices Network helps people to recognize that, as I said earlier, anyone's at risk, and so having these symptoms is not an unusual or uncommon kind of thing. And all you have to do is sort of ask people about their folklore and their histories, and you'll hear stories that are really unusual or interesting, but the community holds. The community has what sometimes might be considered symptoms, but sometimes just plain not. And so hearing voices is just a thing, and it can be managed, and it can be lived with, and ignored, or fought against, or commented on. And it's a useful resource for people who do actually hear voices. And one of the important parts about treating illnesses is telling people what their illness is so they can go online and become part of the network and get connected to other people who deal with the same kind of problem.
Okay. I have lots of cards here, so let me take a card. We do have one here. Can we get emailed a copy of this, I think, slides? We can make that happen? Okay, so we'll make that happen. Take care of that one. Dr. Weintraub, there's some questions here for you. Are people overdosing on opioid or synthetic drugs, fentanyl, and the Karin fentanyl?
Yes. I don't know if this works or not. Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest reason why people are dying, because these drugs are being mixed into the heroin, and people really don't even know what they're taking, and they're so potent that's, one of the slides actually showed the increase in opioid overdose deaths just related to fentanyl. So that is a major cause of why we're seeing this increase in overdose deaths.
Okay. Question? Please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just have a statement. This really had touched my heart. I remember watching a movie with this little kid, and it was called Pass It Forward. And he was a son of a mother who was addicted to drugs. And his life was tremendously difficult. And my statement is, if there's any children that we know of and love as this family right here, please pass it forward.
Thank you. Okay, we have many questions. Let's move on. Dr. Cooper, there's a question here. You spoke about trauma, those that are exposed to violent can become violent. I'm interested in those who are exposed who do not become violent. Can you speak to that?
So I think that certainly most of our patients who get just minor exposure to violence are not. I think that what we're finding in our work is that in our communities in which there is, especially in kids who are chronically exposed to it, it just becomes sort of the norm. And certainly that doesn't mean that all those kids from those communities are going to become violent, but it means that they are at risk for it. You know, I grew up in a neighborhood where there were gunshot wounds. Gunshots going off in the middle of the night is fairly common, and there were folks in my neighborhood who got shot and who got killed. That was just, it was the way it was. I had grandparents and great-grandparents who said, who taught me that was not the norm. And there are folks who said that wasn't the norm. That was part of the environment, but that wasn't the norm. And so there are, it's like anything else that that's a part of we're growing up. There's the environmental part of it, there's the genetic part of it, and all that comes together to impact how you handle this and how you develop. But I think it's important for us as a community to realize that if we're going to impact that kind of behavior, we have to impact how our communities function and what their makeup is. And we can't just sort of say, even for those who don't live in those communities, for those at the university, for example, part of the surrounding community, we need to be involved and try to decrease these kinds of events in our communities. Can I say something about that?
Go ahead.
Yeah. One way in our community which, particularly sexual violence, for people who don't turn to violence themselves, manifests is surprisingly in obesity. And so there is a study and a series of studies related to what's called adverse childhood experiences. And there are a number of people who have had sexual violence in particular who essentially, in a sort of a very layman's way, turn on themselves. And so they gain a lot of weight. And I've had a couple of patients who tell me that, they feel protected in their so-called fat suit because they're no longer, in their minds, attractive, and so no one will put their hands on them anymore. And so what happens is that when these folks start to lose weight, they leave treatment, and they were leaving treatment very quickly because they were starting to get attention again, and they didn't want that, and so they would leave treatment for obesity is what I'm talking about. So there are some people who don't turn on other people, but on themselves, unfortunately.
Thank you. Another question, Dr. Weintraub. Methadone and Suboxone seem like a hustle after a while. Some people want to stop and are kept on it. Can you address this?
Sure. So I think there's a lot of debate within even the drug treatment community, and you hear people talking about being addicted to another drug because both methadone and buprenorphine or Suboxone are opioids. However, the evidence has clearly shown that people that take it and take it the right way, and it's not a cure-all for everything. And like Dr. Adams said about chronic mental illness, there's other components to medication-assisted treatment that help people recover. So it's not enough just to take medicine, but you have to rehabilitate your life as well. And the studies show clearly that people that take this medicine, in addition to the other therapies, do much better in staying alive, being productive citizens. Do some people sell and divert medicine? Yes, they do. However, the risk, there was actually a study of people that had been maintained and done well on methadone, and when they were tapered off of it, 80% had relapsed within a year. And I think the biggest concern now is that the lethality of a relapse is very high. So one use used to be, it wasn't good to relapse on heroin, but I didn't worry that the next day the patient would be dead. And now with the drugs that are out there, it's so lethal that people do better. We don't force people to stay on it. My job as a physician is to be a collaborative partner to my patient and educate them about the risks and benefits of their treatment, and we work with people that want to come off the medicine if they'd like, but we have to be honest about what the potential consequences are. So, hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Eric. There's some questions that are quite lengthy, and so we're trying to take some of the shorter ones so we can get as many in as possible. I just want to remind people at lunch, you can select a table lunch with an expert or a leader where we have an expert at the table and you can eat your lunch and ask lots more questions. So some of these longer questions actually may be able to be addressed in that setting as well. So let me try to take a couple more before we run out of time. What? Oh, I didn't see that line. You're supposed to be up here. I didn't realize that was the line. I thought you guys would just hold the wall up. I apologize, please.
I guess this question is for anyone on the panel. My name is Dr. Alice Delaney, and I have a research interest in behavioral health intervention. And I noticed that there's a lot of emphasis placed on depression and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and so forth. But my question is, in terms of early intervention, is there any research being done on BPD, borderline personality disorder, and how does that play into early intervention in addressing some of these more major situations?
I'll take a stab at it. Okay. Borderline personality disorder is a series of behaviors that get people into trouble in life. And I'm sure there's some research being done on it, but I'm not specifically aware of it. And it's something that sort of materializes as people grow older. You can't really get that diagnosis until you're an adult. And oftentimes there are behaviors earlier in life that head you in that direction. And I think they're very difficult to figure out until you're sort of in the midst of it. So that's kind of, and I don't know if anybody else has.
And we professionally aren't very good about dealing with borderline personality disorder. And one of the things we tend to do is call it by another name. We'll call the person saying they have bipolar disorder, bipolar 2. That's not what it is. It's borderline personality disorder, and people are afraid to say it to patients. It is not fair. It's just similar to cancer 50, 60 years ago. We won't tell people what the illness is, so they have no capacity to go study it, learn about it, meet other people who have it, and learn how to cope with it. And so before we even get to early intervention, can we just call it by its name?
Okay. Please come up. Try to keep your questions short so we can get many in.
Okay. Good afternoon. My concern could go to any of the panel, but mostly, I apologize, the last doctor.
Weintraub.
Okay. I'm actually a CEO of Bright Horizons Behavioral Health. And we just opened a couple weeks ago. We service youth and adults for mental health and substance abuse. And what we are finding with this epidemic is that everyone that's coming to us needs a higher level of care, inpatient. Literally last week, I took a gentleman to 3 or 4 hospitals telling me that they no longer have an inpatient program, or they only have, excuse me, I get really emotional about this, or they only have 11 beds. I don't really understand where the missing link is for a provider and the resources to be able to help these people. I have over 5,000 square feet of space, and I'm trying to keep them in a program that I can't even get them resources for. So any help that you could help with, I would greatly appreciate that.
Call Mitch McConnell.
All right, Mitch. And we have a medical doctor that prescribes Suboxone that doesn't have a waiting list. We accept Medicaid. I mean, we have all the things in place. But it just seems like because of this epidemic, it's that they need a higher level of care. And I hear all these resources, and then when I call, there's, you know, a waiting list, or they have to go through all these things. And when you have an addict that wants to recover that day, they don't have tomorrow, because most of my patients have fentanyl in their system right now with heroin.
So,
So
Dr. Weintraub,
basically, I'm not a doctor, but I just want to say this so people understand that our brains does not have to tell us to breathe. These people, when they take the fentanyl and the heroin or the fentanyl, their brain no longer tells them to breathe. That's why they can breathe while they're awake, but when they go to sleep, they don't breathe because their brain is not telling them to breathe. So anyone have any suggestions how I should be able to help my clients?
so we're talking about access to care and the right
Yes.
level of care.
So as a hospital administrator, we're very aware of your issue. And we were talking about this before we began the panel. It's an issue around the state and around the country. The Maryland Hospital Association has been holding meetings and conferences and work groups on it. At every ED in the country in the morning, there are 4 or 5 or 6 patients hanging out waiting for inpatient sources. And if you're under 18 or if you're a kid, I've had kids spend 4 days in my emergency room psychiatric area waiting for placement because we don't take kids there. So it's a huge problem for us. The good news for us is that the Maryland Hospital Association and advocacy groups around the state are working on it. They know that we need to try to figure out resources. The answers are not there yet, but at least we are. I'm as everyone knows, what we're going to get from at the federal side is we can't depend upon it at this point. I have no clue what it's going to be, but we have to, I think, really work with our state resource legislation and make them realize that we, as a state, know this is a priority, and that we want our state to continue to work on it. And when we hear people say that folks don't die because of access, we need to stand up and yell and say that's not true. Because all of us in this room know that patients do die without adequate insurance or without access, without question. And we need to keep sounding that alarm that is happening.
And they also need to hold people accountable that are getting funding for these treatment programs, because they're telling me that the pool is no longer able to be expanded for a LAA to be a part of that. And I'm also a real estate broker, so I can get housing for my people, but I've already taken my whole life savings to open this program. And then they're telling me that I cannot get funding because I'm in Baltimore County, but I'm right on the Baltimore City line, and this epidemic is everywhere, so.
Yeah, I was just going to add, so it's complicated because I think they are trying to increase access to inpatient beds. I'm not a believer that, I think a lot of good work can be done as outpatient, but some of the social resources aren't available. So housing is a huge piece of this, and there's no doubt about it.
And
So-
transportation.
Yeah, and transportation. So if we could sort of redirect our resources into those, we could save probably money from having to put people in inpatient facilities. Here at the university, I see the team here, we've been utilizing peer recovery coaches. We have a team of peer recovery coaches in the emergency department that work with all of our addicted individuals, and they do interventions and help find placement for our patients and have actually done a great job in finding what some of the resources are. So, I mean, we could always connect and see if there's some resources that we may know of that you're not aware of. But I think your point, the peer recovery coaches are really a help to some of these patients and guiding them through their resources. But getting support for housing and transportation is just a huge problem that we have
And
as well.
inpatient care.
Yeah.
Thank you very much
Thank
for your
you.
question. Okay, so we actually are out of time for this block. What I want to bring to people's attention is we have lunch with a leader. We have 2 tables set up for addiction and substance abuse, 2 tables for depression, 1 for domestic violence, 1 for anxiety, 1 for elder mental health care, and another for violence and trauma. So those are tables with experts, and I would encourage you to take your questions to those tables and have a discussion over lunch. I apologize. Lots of passion, lots of energy, all important questions and content. In the afternoon, we have breakout groups, again, around a lot of these topics that will invite lots of discussion. So this is only the beginning, not the end of the opportunity for the conversation. I want to thank our panelists, Grace Serafini, Curtis Adams, with Dr. Cooper and Weintraub.
Part of the reason that so many folks are not, don't have inpatient.
Thank you, Jill, again, and panelists. Thank you very much for all the information that you shared. I said at the beginning that there was lots of energy in this room, and I encouraged you to keep it up. There has been tremendous energy in this room, and we're so impressed, of course, by your passion. Let me reiterate what Jill just said. We will have time during lunch, if you choose, to continue the dialogue, and all the topics are listed in your program, but we want to make sure we give time for all the speakers this morning. Let me also mention, I talked to you about some of the things in your folder. There is an evaluation form in your folder. We would appreciate it if you would evaluate the programs this morning, and as well the ones which you attend this afternoon. If you drop them off at the table where you came in and registered, you can also get a free gift as you leave. Someone asked the question about presentations and handouts. We will post those on the website in a few days, the presentations, the handouts, and contact information for the exhibitors, which are out front. So you'll have that available to you later. Our final speaker this morning is Dr. Connie Knoll, who is a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner. She currently practices at University of Maryland, Upper Chesapeake Health, in behavioral health consultation and inpatient services. Prior to this, she worked for many years in community psychiatry at the University of Maryland Medical Center right up the street. And she's a volunteer at the Red Cross, and if you ask her, she has some tremendous stories about the time she spent, I remember this, in New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina. I leaned over to her maybe even an hour ago and said, some of this information is depressing. I mean, it's very, very impactful, and she said, the purpose of my talk. Her talk is on wellness and principles of recovery.
How do I move this?
Thank you. I have to say that it's a great privilege to be here today. I am humbled and honored to be a part of this. My topic today is about mental wellness, and I have a couple of objectives that I want to address. One is, and I think Donna sort of just alluded to this, is that we've been talking about things that are symptoms of illness, and what I want to talk about is how do you tell, in a very broad sort of way, when is something normal and when is it a symptom of an illness? And the most concise answer to that question has to do with how much function the symptom or the phenomena interferes with your life and how long it lasts. All these things I'm going to be talking about are very complex. And I could probably speak an hour on each slide, but I'm going to have to try to move on that. I want to talk about a little bit about what happens in life that we all have to deal with that's not necessarily part of an illness, but can cause some of the same sort of symptoms. And then I'll begin to talk about how do you make your best self every day? What are the concepts of a wellness toolkit? So those are my goals for the next 30 minutes, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. First of all, I didn't talk to Dr. Jameson this morning, and she did mention animal discriminations. And I'd like to just throw this out because I think we have to think about the words we use and how we speak every day. And how many people say in passing, "You're crazy," "I'm crazy," or "I'm feeling so bad I'm going to shoot myself." So these are things that on my end of the world we take very differently. And I would challenge people to think about their language with what they refer to as something that's different from the norm. And I would like to say that there's a way to reframe the cow that's hanging from the tree, is that they've learned far more skills. They've learned how to climb trees. They've learned how to defy gravity. They have a totally different perspective of the world, and they've mastered speaking English. So the brain and behavior are very complicated. We've gotten that from the talks this morning. But what I would like to say is that as a clinician and in research, we understand a lot about what we call the bottom up and the top down. We don't know much about the middle, but we're learning. So what I mean by that is we know a lot about the intracellular level of the brain and how medications work and what happens with neurons and how they communicate and how that ends up into some behaviors. We also know something about human nature, what is typical human behavior, but we don't know is what goes into people's judgment, what goes into people's motivations. How do some people have such resilience and others don't have that much? Or what about hardiness? Some people seem to thrive on conflicts and do well with it, and others don't. Human beings are very complicated. We're the same in many ways, but we're also very different. There's many variations of what could be considered normal, and there is no real yardstick of this is normal and this isn't, except in some of the extremes we heard about this morning and what is a law. So it's all about, in some ways, context and perspective. So you've seen the story about the people who are blindfolded and they're all taking a different part of the elephant, so they think it's something different. I want to let you know that I really use that every day because when I do an assessment, I'm very well aware of the fact that I'm probably looking at one of those pieces, and that's why I value people's families, people's significant others, and I respect that I only see a person for a very short time. Perspective, I had a wonderful mentor who said, you really can look at the same thing and have two different people say totally different things, and they both can be right. It took me a long time to understand how that would actually be able to be happening. But I want to tell you a little bit about my perspective. And some of it comes from working in disasters and the Red Cross. Because when you go to a disaster and people are all surviving a catastrophe, what you look for is not pathology or not symptoms. You look for what the function that they can do is, and you build from that. That got me thinking well over 20 years ago about what we could do differently in terms of being providers. The other thing that is sort of dovetails with that is the whole notion of the recovery movement. Because you look at how can a person do well in life no matter what they're dealing with. And so I think that's really important, and Dr. Curtis Adams talked about that in terms of treatment. So this slide could be a college course, and I have about 30 seconds to cover it, but we did talk a little bit about norms in terms of age. And so just as an example, we talked about I think it was Dr. Adams again, who said something about all the gray hair in the room. So I want to let you know in the morning, when I look in the mirror, this is silver. This is silver, okay? So all about how you reframe and redo and think about things differently. And I will say this, because we are living in an extreme political environment, and I want to say that what I want, hopefully, people to do is not to lose their humanity, to think about empathy and connections between human beings, and I'll just leave it at that. So it's all about function, and yes, I'm anxious, so my mouth is dry. So it's all about function, and what I'm going to do is talk about several areas of function. And I want to say that most people sometimes have doubts about their own self. And they think, well, that person looks so healthy, and that person has achieved, and that person has done this, and I'm not like that. But the truth is that every person struggles with something at some time. That's why the statistics about the need for mental health, in addition to having illnesses that need to be addressed, that's why some people could use treatment at any different points when they're dealing with crisis or developmental issues or something like that. So the basics, and Grace alluded to this in terms of the vegetative signs, are sleep, nourishment, and exercise. The things that affect your body. I think there's a single thing that can improve mood for most people who are not in need of medications for depression is making sure they get an adequate number of sleep. And he talked about that this morning in terms of the disc jockeys. You keep them up for several days, they can get psychotic symptoms. Nourishment also, I would add, think about the substances that people put in their bodies, because people will look for maybe some unhealthy ways of nourishment as a self-soother, and I'll talk about that more later. So some other aspects is relating with others. I think relationships are truly like the hardest thing in life. We spend our whole lives trying to master them and have them be a part of what supports us and nourishes us and makes us feel like we're connected to others. And they're also a very important part of productivity. Another thing is the whole diversion aspect of life. We are human beings. We want to have enjoyment out of life. We want to have fun. We want to have pleasurable activities. And sometimes people who are in stress or having difficulties or having illness symptoms don't give enough time for this, or perhaps they give too much. But it's an important part of keeping yourself on an even keel and being your best self. And the other aspect has to do with what I would call the big picture, which is the whole questions of what is the meaning of life, spiritual beliefs, and purpose. So the quote here is from Pablo Picasso. I don't know if you can see it that well on the slide, but it says, "The meaning of life is to find your gift, and the purpose of life is to give it away." So some people deal with thinking about these things all the time, and some people never hardly think about this unless they get to a crisis or a catastrophe or something like that. So life always brings challenges. Part of living means that there's change and emotional pain sometimes. I mentioned about developmental stages and changes. Moving from adolescence to adulthood is a huge one. But there's also challenges at each stage of development. And there are catastrophic events that happen. And I will say this, because all the literature about disaster and recovery has to do with the fact that it's not necessarily what happens to you, it's how you deal with it. Because I have seen personally people who have had horrendous things happen to them, and they are resilient. And those are the people that kind of keep me going, because I want to also say that, you know, the doctor who spoke about the violence spoke about the emotional abuse as a child in terms of the increased emotional abuse of a child increased the return visits for the violence. But an important perspective from that slide is also that 75% of people who had emotional abuse didn't have this. And 89% of the control group didn't have this. So we have to keep in mind that there are many people who have dealt with adversity and poor circumstances and have done really well. So a little bit about the signs of stress is similar to some of the symptoms we saw earlier, feeling physically and mentally drained, having trouble with focus, being easily frustrated and irritable, feeling tired, sad, numb, lonely, or worried, and then experiences those changes in the function. So everyone gets stressed, and everyone can have these symptoms or these phenomena. It doesn't mean that you are ill. It means that you're living and you're adjusting to things that happen. And again, you may have an illness on top of it, or you may not. But it's the level of function that gets disrupted, as well as the duration of how long that disruption lasts. So what are the things that you can do? Well, we all have self-soothing behaviors. And I like the Linus and the blanket. Not too many adults run around sucking their thumbs and holding a blanket, and that's a good thing. So, and one of the things I would just throw out there is have your self-soothing behaviors, or what you do, have they evolved as you've aged? Are they becoming healthier, or are you choosing things that may interfere with your ability to function? And then depending on the life circumstances, I mean, everybody experiences the loss of a loved one at some point in their life. And there's a need to have a new normal in terms of a coping mechanism, because some things that happen mean that things are never the same. So, the wellness toolkit. So what makes you be your best self every day? When you have a great day, if you've examined it, what were the ingredients? What makes you feel like you can deal with almost anything? What are those components? And so I think a good example of thinking about this is if you work with a group of people, and sometimes that group of people can change of who's exactly there every day, you walk in sometimes and you feel like, oh, we can accomplish anything today because this is a great group. That's what we might want to think about in terms of what you would strive for in like workplace relationships. But your personalized wellness kit is made up of all these things that you've identified that are individual to you, of what makes you have your best day, what makes you be your best self every day. So this is a combination, again, of sort of thinking about a wellness kit as well as psychological first aid principles. So what is the basics? Back to the basic function. How many hours of sleep do you need to be your best every day? Well, that's the plan for your every day. That's, you want to be your best? Get that number of hours of sleep. What is the balance in your nutrition? What's the best hydration? What's the best for you? And exercise. Get active. Do what you enjoy. Also, for relaxation and diversion, you need to make time for the things that give you joy. One of the things that I always do is that I have a long commute, and so I really appreciate nature, even as it passes by quickly. I enjoy sunsets, sunrises, I like the colors in the sky, I like seeing the different flowers bloom, and that's just me. You might have your own ideas about what things you like, what things make you think about how life is good. And relaxation. So, you see a lot of different things, meditate, yoga, massage. Some people hate massage, some people would never do yoga. You need to sort of explore and figure out what's best, what do you really love, and make time for that in your life. And then I do think there's spirituality, nourishing your soul, even if you're not religiously inclined. I think that there's a component that is that deeper meaning in life that people yearn for putting something in. And I think that one of the things that gets people into trouble, and gets people into trouble in terms of sleep, is at the end of the day, when you're trying to go to sleep, you ruminate and think about everything that's bad that happened. I should have done this, I didn't do this enough, I didn't do that, or, that didn't go well. And how can anybody fall asleep if they've got all that on their brain? So what I do, and I've recommended this, and I've never had anybody come back and say, Connie, that was a terrible idea, is that I make sure that I bring up everything that went well that day. And I replay it like a tape. This went well, this went well. And even if it's the worst day, I'll think about things that I'm grateful for. And I can always come up with those. And what I found, and other people have told me, is that doing that is good to help you sleep, but it also makes you wake up feeling very refreshed. So when you know you're stressed, stay connected with family and friends. And if you need to build that network, then work on building that network. You need to have some patience. If you're going through one of the things that we know is life problematic, or a catastrophe, or a high stressor, or loss of a loved one, other people around you are probably affected as well, so be patient. And also, take tasks small at a time. Don't think of the whole uphill climb you need to make, but take small steps towards that goal. And again, try to stay positive, reframe things as positively as you can. If you have a friend who can really reframe things for you, use that person. If your self-help is exhausted and you're still feeling the problems, then that's the time to reach out for professional help, for sure. So what are the outcomes for positive wellness? It should improve people's judgment. There's growth, becoming more wise about life and what you're doing, and you should have better decision making. Because life also brings all these things: joy, laughter, happiness, and satisfaction, even if you have a mental illness, even if you're dealing with horrible things that other people haven't had to deal with. Life also brings these things. And so I found this poem, and I thought it would be perfect for this topic. It says, life is amazing, and then it's awful, and then it's amazing again. And in between the amazing and the awful, it's ordinary and mundane and routine. Breathe in the amazing, hold on through the awful, and relax and inhale during the ordinary. That's just living the heartbreaking, soul-healing, amazing, awful, ordinary life. And that's breathtakingly beautiful. So, I've covered a lot in a, all right. I've covered a lot in a very short span. I know I haven't done justice to many topics that I've tried to cover. I am available at lunch, and Janice and I, who you've seen at the microphone, are doing a recovery workshop this afternoon. So I'll be happy to take some questions. And I'm way early. I thought I had less time or something. So I've left you speechless? Or hungry? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. Well, I feel that we've had a terrific morning, starting with a magnificent, dynamic speaker. We've addressed some of the issues, symptoms related to mental illness and substance abuse, and then we had Connie uplift us and give us some thoughts as to how to keep ourselves well.